Good evening and welcome to the Ark of Alabama's webinar series on self-determination. Thanks for joining us and uh, Merry Christmas. If you saw the beautiful tree on the screen earlier, you're kind of getting the festive mood, but appreciate y'all joining in. This is the first part of the series on self-determination. We have three more. We'll have another. If you want to mark it down on your calendar already, will be February, and they're all on Thursday nights at 6 o'clock. So we have the first one on. The next one will be on February 15th, and then March 21st, and the next series, part two, will be in January. So that's January 18th, February 15th, and March 21st to conclude the series. I'm Tim Cooper, the Executive Director, and in just a few seconds, we'll introduce our host for tonight, Ms. Kim Spangler, our Family Outreach. If you get behind or you need to ask a question, you can just speak or put it in chat first so we can see it, and then we'll try to answer it. And we're working on getting the sound coming through so we can actually hear your question. If you miss any part of the series, they will be posted. We're filming live, even though we are live, we're filming, and they'll be posted on Alabama Care's Facebook and the Ark of Alabama's Facebook page, so you can go back and catch anything you missed or catch a series that you missed. But thank you very much for that. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Kim Spangler, and thank y'all for joining.
Okay, thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited about this series. Self-determination in and of itself is a very broad concept. So we tried to break it down into four easy to swallow parts. And what we're going to do is kind of chew on that first part this week. And that is going to be the history and the perspectives of disability and how they've shifted through the years, and then what that has done with our mindsets toward disability, so that we can kind of have a really good foundational understanding of where we came from, and then kind of apply that information to where we are. And then hopefully by the end of this series, you'll have a really good understanding of where we're going with all of this, with the whole idea and concept behind self-determination. So this is definitely by far one of my most favorite topics, and I'm so excited to get to share it with everybody. As Tim said, it's going to be recorded, and so if you want to share this link with friends or family that you think could benefit, please do. The more the merrier. The more people we get this information out to, the better off everybody will be. I'm a firm believer in sharing information. Information is meant to be shared. So please help us do that. The places you can find it, like Tim said, are the Alabama Care Facebook page. Alex is hosting us and recording us, and he's got all this technology set up in my living room, and it looks like I'm in Hollywood at this point. So we're going to be good to go by the end of this series, and you can always go back and rewatch if there's something you missed. So hopefully everybody got their training guide. What I want you to do, if you didn't get your training guide, is type into the chat so we can make sure that you get that before we keep going any further. The training guide is something we're going to go through real quickly tonight, and then we're going to have open discussion after we go through it. And hopefully we'll just kind of turn this into a big opportunity for connection between our families and everybody else is out there that are joining us, so that we can help our loved ones reach their goals towards self-determination. We've got a lot of people who have a lot of good ideas, and they found plenty of those good ideas that have worked for them. We want to put you into an environment where you can share all of your good ideas, where you have tried something and it worked and it went well. And then moving forward, we're going to have different people come in and share what they've done and how it worked for them. But to start out, before we get too far into the weeds of all of that, we're going to really focus on what our worldview or what our mindset or perspective is based on for disability, based on what we've seen, what we've known, what we've come to believe, and how that shapes our responses, how that shapes our attitude toward disability going forward. So I'm excited to get started on all of this. If you have questions, put them into the chat and we will ask those questions out loud, or we'll try to see if we can hear you ask the question, but we will get to your questions. So we don't want to have anybody leave this meeting without having their questions answered. If I can't answer it myself, I'll find somebody who can answer it for you. All right, so have we got anybody in the chat that said they did not get the workbook? A few, okay.
Actually didn't as well.
Ashley or Heather. Okay, so check all your emails and make sure that it didn't go to your junk mail. And if you do find it, make sure you scroll all the way to the bottom of that email. But I will definitely send out more via email for both Ashley and Heather and anybody else that lets us know that they didn't get one. All right, so let's get started. Let's pull up that first page of our training guide and dig in. All right, so self-determination and what it is. This whole first part is going to be talking about how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. We're going to look at the disability history, those cultural shifts, and what it has done with our mindsets, where we are now moving forward. So next slide. This is for anyone who is a parent or a caregiver of someone who has an intellectual disability, a developmental disability, or a dual diagnosis of one or the other or both, or even mental illness. So we've got all three of those categories that could apply here. And if it's a person that has a disability themselves, whether they're a parent, a caregiver, or they're just living on their own independently, they could probably benefit from this too. So I'll start with myself, and I would love to hear from anybody else out there going forward, but I am the parent of a 24-year-old son who has a disability, and my son's disability happens to be cerebral palsy, and so for him, it's a developmental disability, which also affects his intelligence, and so there was plenty of learning and growing we did together as I raised him, going through IEP meetings, going through different developmental milestones with pediatricians, all of the medical issues involved. So I can certainly relate to parents or caregivers in that area. But I was also the sibling of my youngest sister who had a developmental disability, and she was blind. And so I grew up with my sister getting a taste or a feel for what it was like to be a caregiver in a small way for somebody with a disability. And then when my first son was born, I got a much bigger idea of what that meant. And so one thing that has made me become really passionate about self-determination is watching how my sister grew and developed and came to terms with her own developmental disability. Long story short, my parents were doing their absolute best. I firmly believe that they wanted everything to be okay for my sister. In doing that, I saw what we would now identify as enabling. I think they were very protective, and their need or their desire to protect her came from a good place. But in doing so, I can see, looking back, that there were some things that kind of enabled her to the point where she was having too much done for her and not really being given the opportunities to do things on her own, to grow and develop and learn the skills that she would need to learn later in life as someone who was blind. And so watching that play out ended up giving me the idea, or it shifted my mindset, so to speak, that when Colby was born, I was not going to go that route. I would refuse to enable him. I almost went too far the other way and made a point of not doing things for Colby or trying not to, and making sure that I provided a way for him to learn how to do whatever it was on his own to get to the point where he could develop those skills for himself. And so I think that that experience growing up with my sister, wanting her to do things on her own, and then having the experience of being Colby's mom and wanting to make sure that I had a way for him to learn how to do things on his own, created a very strong passion in me for what we now call self-determination. And so that's kind of where all this is coming from. That's my background story, my heart, my passion. And we'll go back to the slide and get started on the mindsets and how those things kind of shift the way we behave. All right, next slide. There it is. Oh, it's being tricky. Keep going. Is that the first one? Oh, there it is. Perfect. Okay. So one big important part of being self-determined means that you know your rights. And we live in a land of civil freedom where we have a lot of rights bestowed on us here as Americans. And there are also human rights. So a very mega important, super important part of being self-determined is that you know your rights and you know what you can do, you know what you're entitled to, you understand your rights going forward and whether or not those rights are being violated. All right. And then the other thing is that you know how to speak up for yourself. When one of your rights are violated, you know how to self-advocate. So it doesn't stop at knowing what your rights are and knowing whether or not they've been violated, but it almost begins there. And then the next step is knowing how to speak up when or if those rights are being violated. For example, there's a big difference between being aggressive when somebody has offended or violated a right versus being assertive. All right. And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit more on that in the future, but advocating for yourself is a big part of it. And then another really important piece of it is having goals and plans and knowing what you want your life to look like down the road, that you understand 5 years from now, these are my goals, this is my vision, this is where I want to be 10 years from now, a week from now, that you are constantly in thinking and planning mode to make sure that your life looks the way you want it to look, that you're not just passively sitting back and allowing things to happen, but you're actively engaged and planning that way. The next part of this is that you understand what kind of support you need to make that plan come together. If somebody is not driving and your goal is to work somewhere that requires you to be able to get transportation to and from that job, then you're going to naturally seek out support for that kind of transportation. So a big part of self-determination is understanding what kind of support you need, how you can get that support, and what kind of a critical role that support will play, and kind of prioritize it. Transportation is a big one for a lot of people. Somebody else might need support with communication or an augmentative communication device. But knowing the kind of support and being able to identify those needs and those areas of need in your life is a big part of it. And then lastly, just being able to create and engage circles of support for yourself within your own community, whether that's natural supports, paid supports, or a combination of the two. But understanding how to build those relationships, whether it's for an IEP team, a supported decision-making team, or person-centered plan, being able to reach out to those people around you and engage them is a really important part of self-determination. Okay, so you ready for the history of this? We're going to talk about what the actual definition of self-determination is. And I think you'll see when we go into the history why that definition is so important. Okay. So the first part of the definition, and this is something I looked up in the Oxford Dictionary and make sure I got it right. But most of you already know it on a level that is true and meaningful to you. But this is what Oxford has to say about that actual definition. The process by which a person attempts to control their own life. For example, services for those with mental challenges should aim to promote an individual's capacity for self-determination. So I thought that was a really fitting definition. Is anybody at the point in their training guide where they can list one way that a provider, a paid provider, paid support could promote self-determination or the capacity for self-determination for somebody that they're caring with or for? Y'all can, if you're on mute, y'all can speak up. If you want to put it into the chat, you can do that too. So what's one way a provider or a paid support can aim to promote an individual's capacity for self-determination? Angie Richardson, I love your answer. Angie Richardson said, offering informed choices to all of the services provided. You just said a lot, Angie, so that's huge. Number one, the first thing I want to pick up on there is that you didn't just put offering choices, you put offering informed choices. That's huge. And we'll talk about the ADA's clause for effective communication and how that plays into informed choices in just a minute. But understanding what your choices are and what the consequences of those choices are when you've made this decision on whatever your options were are huge. So thank you for putting informed choices. And then the second part of what you said, to all the services provided. In other words, when you're creating a person-centered plan with a provider, it's so important as a provider or a paid support person to make sure that you're offering all of the options and not just the ones that you're comfortable with, or not just the ones that you think might work for that person, because that's not our choice to make, right? It's the person's decision. And so they need to see all of their options. So thank you for phrasing it that way. All right. And then there was somebody else. Angel said, advocate for residents to have the most independent life as possible. And by residents, I can only assume you mean people who may live in a group home. Angel, she's nodding yes. So that's absolutely true. That's right. To have the most independent life as possible. It gets hard in a group home. You're sharing your space and your time with at least 2, maybe 3 other people in the same house. So just like if you can ever imagine a time where you had a roommate that was not your family member, or even just with a family member, when you're in the same space at the same time with other people who have other ideas and other plans, it's hard to make sure that you're living the life that you want to live. And so making a concerted effort to make sure that that person's idea of independence is being formed and getting worked on while they're there is a big part of it. So yeah, great answers.
Angie also said,
All would include, Angie said, all would include all that the person has an interest in. Yes, and you don't know that unless you're communicating on a consistent basis with that person, right? So we can't bring our own preconceived ideas into that conversation. We have to talk to them and learn what their interests are. And so anything they're interested in, whether you're interested in it or not, anything they're interested in should be laid on the table and talked about as an option. Yes, great answers. Okay, so let's move to the second part of the training guide. Y'all are going to list 2 more ways, but those were some great answers. List 3 ways that a family member or a caregiver can aim to promote an individual's capacity for self-determination. So this is a little bit different because we're not talking about somebody who's coming from a paid support or provider perspective. We're talking about somebody that's coming from more of a natural support, somebody who's doing it because that's what they do. Other ways, how would it look different for somebody in a natural support role versus a paid support role? Any ideas on that? All right, we can come back to it. We'll wrap around at the end and come back to it. I'm not going to give you the answers right up front. But if you noticed at the end of our training guide, we've got the whole answer key right there for you. So I love it. Angie, I think you and I have had the same classes, maybe through Pippa, I don't know. So Angie, will you type out what the acronym SMART is for everybody so they can see it in writing? I don't want to annihilate, I'll butcher it if I try, but create a list of SMART goals. Yes, that's a really good way. And somebody who is a close family member would have so much insight with that person in doing that. So yes, thank you. All right. Now, there's an old saying before we get much further into the history. There's an old saying that I love, and it says, if you give a man a fish, he will eat for a day. He will have a meal, right? If you teach a man to fish, he will eat for a lifetime. And so I love that because it speaks directly to self-determination. That's what we're doing here. We're teaching people to fish. We're teaching them how to help themselves. And that carries on for a lifetime versus just helping them in the moment for whatever that need is to come up. All right. I don't think they knew this way back then, or if they did, they hadn't caught on to it to the point that we have now, because this part of our history I refer to as the disability dark ages. The Greek and Roman empires and the Renaissance period looked at, and you can see this in all of the history books, but they looked at disability as a problem. They were not accepted. They were actually outcast to the point where it was an embarrassment and a shame on a family to have a member of their family with a disability. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't studied. It was just one of those issues that came up. And if it did come up, it was quickly hidden from society because it was embarrassing or shameful to have someone in your family with a disability. And so because of the lack of information and knowledge around disability, not much progress was made during that time, during the Greek and Roman Empire or the Renaissance period, because people's minds were trying to avoid it rather than trying to embrace it and learn about it. And so that's kind of why we call it the disability dark ages. We certainly don't want to go back there. I don't think we will. I think we've learned enough now to know better. All right. And then the next age and stage in history that we learn next slide is talking about, we kind of move forward a little bit, but not enough, talking about the institutionalization and experimentation in disability. They did open their minds up to wanting to learn more and wanting to understand more, but it wasn't in a way that really benefited the person with a disability to the point that it can now. Good intent, well-intentioned or not, what ended up happening was if you had a disability, even my son, my 24-year-old son who had cerebral palsy, because he had seizures, back in the 17 and 1800s, he would have been institutionalized. That's just what they did. Now we know better, and we don't think that that'll happen. But back then, if you had any kind of medical problem or intellectual issue, any kind of developmental disability, the immediate reaction of the doctors or the medical profession would be they've got to go to the institution. And in fact, a lot of times the onus was put on the parents because the parents were not seen as professional or capable enough to provide the necessary care for their child. And that was seen as something that was the doctor's job. And so how did you get that care? You sent your child to an institution. And so during that time, it was not necessarily the best environment, but it is what they had. And a lot of people, while they were being institutionalized, unfortunately, had to experience something that we now refer to as experimentation. And that went way too far. That even went into sterilization of anybody that had an intellectual or developmental disability, because at the time, the belief was that whatever it was that caused this issue could be contagious and or passed down. And so they were trying to stop that from happening. And that's where the experimentation led. People thought different exercises to the extreme kind of exercises, like carrying weights around for 12 hours at a time, would increase your strength in your body, which would also increase the strength of the mind. Now we know better, but that back then, that's what they believed. Those experimental kind of times led to the idea that there was a problem. The belief was there's a problem that you have to solve, and this is how we're going to fix it. And so that mindset carried out into the next generations. And then on the next slide, you'll see what we now refer to as the deinstitutionalization and the Civil Rights Act. And that was right around the mid-1900s to 1960s. And the ARC was formed in 1950, in fact, and it was because of a group of parents who realized these institutions are not doing what we thought they would do. Let's provide another way. Let's provide another option for our children to not have to go to these institutions, but still get some kind of training and support. And that's how ARCs were started. And that kind of became the next big era or the next big idea. And at the same time, the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights movement became so big that any kind of segregation or isolation was looked down on. They understood that it's not okay to segregate and isolate a person, regardless of the reasons. And so that kind of pushed us forward, and we started understanding, oh, there is a place that we can provide, even if it's just even through our own homes, that will do as much, if not more, for someone with a disability than an institution has been able to do at this point. And so we closed, I think the last one was 1999. I Googled that and there were multiple answers, but the most common answer was for Alabama, 1999, when our last institution was closed. And so that's over. And now, next slide, we're coming out of the fight for inclusion. We've been doing that for years and years and years, ever since the civil rights movement. There's still a lot of fighting going on, but if you look at your training guide, part of that was in the 1970s. You saw what we now call as the Brown versus the Board of Education, where we understood every child, not specific children, just any child, every child has the right to attend public school to get a free and appropriate education. And that's the basis of IDEA moving forward. And then this wonderful person, Judy Heumann, came along. We call her the mother of disability rights at this point because of everything that she accomplished in her time. The late, great Judy Heumann, along with several others, but she was the first one that came to mind because of her recent passing and how much she accomplished in the fight for inclusion with the ADA and helping with the DD Act and everything else that she did, we started seeing that if we're going to maintain this life outside of an institution, we're going to have to fight for our rights, for belonging, and that kind of awareness, and it worked. And so if you can remember, I don't know, just 12 short years ago, it was an issue to make sure that effective communication was happening on any level for somebody with an intellectual disability. Now with AI, with augmentative communication devices, and with everybody understanding I have a right to understand this information so that I can make an informed decision, I would say the fight for inclusion has been pretty successful. Have we finished it? Did we achieve everything? Probably not yet. There's probably still some room for some fights for inclusion to occur, but we're not approaching it in such a militant way that we used to. We're approaching it in a softer way now, and we've kind of moved on to what we're now calling, or what has been called, the next slide, the era for self-determination, because we're all very aware of our rights at this point and how to advocate. And so what we're seeing come from that is the era of self-determination. And I love it. And I'm so excited about it because it just makes the future look so much brighter for all of those to come. You'll see with the home and community-based settings rule of 2014, all the way to, what are we in now? Almost in 10 years later, almost in 2024, we've gotten to the point where the home and community-based settings rule is the expected standard. That has become, if you're going to look for paid support and you're going to get support provided to you, you've got to meet these certain standards and criteria, which place someone in their home and or community to receive those services, not in an institution. And so I think that's huge. Another good example of self-determination would be the Andrew case in 2017, where the old standard used to be the minimus. They called it de minimis. The minimal amount of progress is all that had to be proven for a child to be able to be passed from one grade to the next and being given a diploma or a certificate of attendance for high school, whatever it was. They didn't have to meet their maximum potential. It was okay until 2017, when this case set precedents, to only meet those minimal standards. So if you had a child who was capable of producing more than those minimal standards, there was no law saying that they had to help that child reach their maximum potential in special ed. There was no law stating that that was the case. Now, after Andrew, it's the maximum. That case set precedent for, you have to not only individualize these standards, but they have to be able to reach their maximum potential in those learning goals for an IEP or any kind of educational setting, special educational setting. Whatever that is for that child, that's now the standard, the maximum. So that's a big step forward for self-determination. And then also the Jenny Hatch case was supported decision-making in 2013, all the way 10 years later here in Alabama with the Colby Act. People understood that to have a guardian removes certain rights that are not necessarily okay to remove from someone just because they need support with making those informed choices. Just because I need support like a financial advisor does not mean that I should have to lose my rights and sign my rights away because I'm asking for someone to guide me in a decision that I'm making. And so the same thing is true for someone with an intellectual or developmental disability. And the Jenny Hatch case set precedent for that. And here we are creating teams all around our nation with supported decision makers who help people retain their rights. They still can vote. They still can marry. They still can have children. They still can operate their own finances with the right support. That's all it takes. And we're learning that as we go. So that was another huge step toward the era of self-determination. I'm sure there's going to be plenty more to come. All right, let's wrap this up on the next slide. After we talked about those the training guide, those 3 different areas in the fight for inclusion, I wanted to talk about the most commonly held beliefs from each era. So if somebody can fill in the blank, the first one, list a commonly held belief from the disability dark ages. What were some things? Y'all can type it into the chat. What were some things that people believed mistakenly during the disability dark ages that they thought were true at the time? It turns out they're just not true. But they were commonly held beliefs. What were a few of those? Oh, while we're waiting on that, Angie typed in the SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Self-care, cooking, cleaning, driving if possible, working are all really good examples of SMART goals. Yes, thank you. Heather Sims, you have to be cared for. Yep. I'm looking at Angie's on the bottom. If I'm reading it correctly, sin or defect were contagious and could be passed down, which would equate to a disability. Absolutely. So the commonly held belief was that if you had a disability, somebody in your family or you yourself had to have committed a sin, or there was some dreaded genetic disease in your family and it was contagious and it was going to be passed down. Correct. That was one commonly held belief for those disability dark ages. Good, Angie. The second one, list a commonly held belief from the era of institutionalization and experimentation. What's something that most people during that time believed was true about disability that now we know is not true? Again, y'all can type it into the chat. That you had, if you had a disability, then the only way for you to get the care or support you needed was through being institutionalized. That was a very commonly held belief. Parents, I will tell you from speaking to older parents, and some who have since passed, they will tell you that they felt embarrassed or ashamed if they did not institutionalize their child. It was commonly believed that the best way to care for your child with a disability was to give them the support, the professional support that came, what they believed was professional, came through and admitting them to an institution. So it was almost expected. So yeah. Correct. All right. List a commonly held belief that came from the era of deinstitutionalization and the civil rights movement. What's something that we all firmly believed during that time period as it relates to disability? When it was deinstitutionalization and the civil rights movement, we started to understand what part of this and how it related to disability. Heather, you're right about that last one. You can't make your own choices on your own. Yes, that was a big part of institutionalization and experimentation, is that they were not, people who had a disability were not capable of making any kind of choice for themselves. That's correct. All right, deinstitutionalization. I'm not giving y'all these answers because you've already got them and you can find them. Oh, there's somebody. Okay. Yes, we understood that to be institutionalized or not allowed to go to school with everyone else, we started to understand that those were forms of discrimination. To take someone and segregate them or isolate them was a form of discrimination. And the civil rights movement within that time period is what helped promote deinstitutionalization. So very good. Another commonly held belief, Ashley says, people with a disability were not worth it for both. Yeah, that's very true. The value of people with a disability was not at all recognized during those time periods. If anything, they were devalued. So that's absolutely correct. All right. And then last but not least, on the next one, Alex is showing my answers to everybody. Well, I know what it is. The next one is the era of self-determination. So what's one of the most commonly held beliefs for the era of self-determination? Where we are now, we're coming into this era of self-determination. What's something we've all begun to understand and believe is true about disability or people with a disability? I can see him typing. Yep, Angel Garrett says that we need to try to maintain our rights. Very good. You got to know what your rights are and speak up for those rights to maintain them. But yeah, another good example of the era of self-determination is that we understand we can make choices for ourselves. If somebody has a disability, they are no longer devalued to the point where we believe someone else has to make all of their decisions for them, but we understand their value is significant enough to give them the opportunities to make their own decisions and show them what choices are out there. So choosing and deciding is a big part of the era of self-determination. Choosing whether or not you want to go to the store that day, choosing what to buy once you're at the store, choosing whether or not you're going to work. And if you're going to work, what kind of job are you going to get? Those kind of decisions are now commonly believed to be a big part of life with a disability. So we're making progress. Heather Sims says, with needed supports, folks can be heard and live independently. Amen. All it takes is the right kind of support and you're good to go. I think we're getting there now in this era of self-determination. One size does not fit all for services, supports, etc. Oh my gosh, is that not truer words have never been spoken? What works for one person may not work for the other, and it's all very uniquely designed to support that person and their needs. I'm talking about support decision making in that way, but yes, that's very true. And I think we're beginning to recognize that. Ashley says, we are worth fighting for ourselves and for others with disability. Yes, it is worth every single ounce of effort that you have. We owe our family members and our loved ones our best efforts. It is literally the least we can do. Someone with a disability, the same thing is true for yourself and for others. It's not only obligatory, but it's almost a privilege to get to help someone feed themselves for life and not just eat for a day, right? So absolutely. Okay, that is going to wrap up actions. Oh, actions always follow beliefs. So the main reason I wanted to go through this foundation and these ages and stages in time in history is that if you understand your actions always follow your beliefs, then you'll be very much more aware of what you're believing and what you're thinking when you're thinking it. Because if you believe someone is worth your time and your effort and your energy, then your actions will back that up. You will go to that person and you will invest your time and your effort and your energy when you see or believe that they have value for that reason. And so I want us to all recognize where our minds are, what we truly think and what we truly believe about disability, or people who have a disability so that we can move forward and recognize, well, I might be saying one thing. Let's make sure I'm doing the same thing that I'm saying, because that's where your behavior comes from, is what you believe. That's where your actions, or that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. All right. I think that's it. The rest is, the rest are resources and the answer key. So I would strongly encourage you all at this point to make sure you go through that list of resources when you have some spare time. There's some really good stuff in there, and it's all related to this first part of this broadcast. And then the next part is going to be equally exciting. It won't be hard. It'll be easy. And we're going to get to talk about everything, self-determination and more. We're going to do supported decision-making. We're going to do self-direction, all of that. So thank you so much for tuning in. This one was quick. This one was easy. Invite your friends for next time. It's just going to keep getting more and better. When we go, I'm going to pass it over to Tim. He's going to sign us out or off. If y'all have any questions at this point for what's coming or what to expect or what we just talked about, now is the time to type those into the chat. But thank you all much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year, and I will see you January 18th next time. All right, now it's Tim.
Thanks, Kim, for presenting that material. I hope you all enjoyed that and got some good information to move forward. Alex, we'll thank Alex from Alabama Cares for presenting this and putting this on. And thank you for taking time out from your evening to join us for this important webinar that we're putting out into the community. The next part will be part 2, as Kim said, and it'll be January the 18th at 6 p.m. About a week prior to that, we'll send you a registration link and the workbook to your email that you register with for part 2. And remember, if there's anything that you need refreshing on about tonight's presentation, it'll be in 2 locations, at Alabama Cares Facebook and then at thearcofal.org. So thank y'all once again very much. Good night. Have a great evening. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank y'all.